Um, I want to spend a few minutes on Brazil, and then briefly before you go, touch on the significance, really big significance of this Michelle Alexander piece
Right.
on getting real about Palestine. But before we go there, I mean, I want to loop back in on Brazil, which I've obviously covered extensively on this show, and just a couple of things. I mean, one, it seems to me that from the reframe of what you're talking about, which is that if we say, first of all, get the resources to people who need it first and foremost, and then secondly, let's talk about, and we're running a little footage here in the background. This is, we're definitely going to get to Lula, the political prisoner who definitely, him being removed from the chessboard is, absolutely a primary reason that this fascist regime is in power in Brazil. But we'll get to that in a second. But starting more broadly, a couple of weeks into this new government, which was backed by all sorts of Western capital interests, literally endorsed by the Wall Street Journal, backed by every type of U.S. and Canadian conglomerate that wants to exploit Brazil imaginable. Bolsonaro and his justice minister, Sergio Moro, the guy who persecuted and hounded Lula and basically, has worked for several years to criminalize the left in Brazil. They're in Davos essentially saying, the paraphrase is like, I don't care if you call me homophobic, I'm not corrupt. Well, in the last couple of weeks, there's been stories of corruption involving Bolsonaro's son that is sort of like just breathtaking, like just even on the level of like, you guys didn't think maybe you should do this a little bit more intelligently than direct deposits if you're going to run a whole campaign supposedly that you're clean. Even more ominously, there's now reporting linking the Bolsonaro political organization with the mafia that assassinated Marielle Franco, which shouldn't surprise anyone. This is a vicious, cruel, dangerous Brazilian government. And they've taken aim out of the gate at indigenous people, labor, LGBTQ, and so on. And so from the perspective of like what a President Bernie would do, okay, it wouldn't be like, nobody's talking about invading Brazil, obviously. But conversely, would a conversation that implicates Bolsonaro be a good example of flipping a humanitarian impulse versus a human rights intervention? Because human rights interventions were always focused on behavior that was obviously totally unacceptable, but also like the most extreme. Samuel Moyn made this point, right? Like
Right.
there isn't that many places in the world, thankfully, that actually are committing like ethnic cleansing as an example. Now, of course, it needs to be responded to, no doubt. And maybe Bolsonaro will get there. Actually, arguably, his policies on the Amazon do amount to ethnic cleansing of indigenous people. But
Right. I was
short
going to
of
say,
that,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, but even just more broadly, like, even before he came to power, the austerity measures of the Michel Temer government brought hunger back into reality, which the Workers' Party had eliminated. Like, what does that look like in terms of like taking on something that is now a U.S. corporate client state, exactly the type of regime the U.S. would install in its imperial history? And now if you had a socialist government in the United States that wanted to exert pressure but not revert to bullying imperial tactics, but of course put pressure on Bolsonaro and the companies here that support him, in fact, and maybe that's the real answer, what would we do?
Right. I think what you said at the end, of course, I think it's totally legitimate for a left-wing government to sanction American companies. And even if they wanted to, I think legitimate to sanction international countries that do business or aid in the persecution of what Bolsonaro is doing. So I think that's an obvious one that I think most on the left would agree with because we're anti-capitalist. The more difficult problem comes in when you start talking about building something like Bernie talked about with the Progressive International, right? Let's say Corbyn wins in the UK and then the United States and the UK form some sort of progressive international coalition and they try to build up essentially what it would be is diplomatic pressure to sanction and morally sanction, but also to hopefully have some sort of specific effect on the material realities of the Bolsonaro administration and their ability to govern. Would that be considered legitimate by the left wing, right? Because that's using basically the tools of statecraft to intervene in some serious regards in the sovereignty of another nation. Now, that other nation might be fascist and we might be against it, but is that considered to be a legitimate tool? And I think these are the questions that we really need to be talking about. So the positive of that is that, of course, the United States and the UK are very powerful nations and that they'll be able to possibly force pressure. The negative of that is that does this create a precedent that allows, for example, the next Donald Trump or the next Mitt Romney or the next whoever it may be, George W. Bush, to also build now a conservative international where that they would be able to advocate against left-wing interests. And I think that's the difficulty, not saying that you wouldn't want to build international pressure, because I think you would want to, but these are the sort of difficulty, unintended consequences type things that we need to think about. And this is why I think it's important for when we start talking about foreign policy, especially going forward, just as people who think about these things, both professionally, but also as any regular guy or girl who does this, who's interested in it, thinks about, is what is the role of civil society groups, particularly left-wing civil society groups, in building the types of transnational solidarities that were first articulated by Marx in the 19th century, but never really came to powerful fruition in the 20th and 21st centuries. So, for example, what is the SEIU's foreign policy? Right. So what are American labor unions' foreign policies, and what are their connections to workers abroad? Now, traditionally, American labor unions, as probably everyone listening to this knows, has been pretty conservative with protecting American wages, protecting American jobs, and looking ways to protect their domestic constituencies. And of course, this makes a lot of sense. I don't need to go into it. But the question is, as we go forward into the 21st century, and it becomes ever more clear that the global networks that were created in the last 125 years aren't going to go away, is if we could actually build transnational imaginaries that unite workers across borders, which is, of course, the original dream of Marxism. And the question is, how do you do that? And then the question is it good to do that through the state, or is it better to do it through civil society organizations like unions? And I think this is just really a fertile area for imaginative thought that I think once we get beyond the knee-jerk anti-imperial critique, which is, of course, like you said, if you read Chomsky, you'll understand the world better than 99% of people who don't read Chomsky. But we need to get beyond that critique and start thinking in these sorts of ways and what types of mechanisms we could use to actually promote our goals.
Specifically on Lula, and I mean, it's funny, you mentioned that, and we wanted to talk specifically about Lula for a couple of minutes because actually the AFL-CIO did send a delegation several months ago, and they were rallying for their worker party's colleagues. They were holding Lula Livre signs. I think there actually has been some progress in that regard with just the realities of globalization and also the new political attitudes injecting themselves. This is somebody who, I always say is the most prominent political prisoner in the world. And also, I just think objectively, in terms of the, taking 30 million people out of poverty, conservative estimate, the most successful president of the 21st century. But he's also exemplifies a broader criminalization of left leaders, certainly across Latin America. I think that there's some signals here that, there's certainly parallels of what Erdogan has done to the HDP Kurdish opposition in Turkey. So it seems to me that in addition to the innate importance of the case, as well as the U.S. role in supporting this horrific, disgusting Sergio Moro figure who persecuted Lula and now serves as justice minister in this Bolsonaro regime, that the imprisonment of Lula and the exposure of so many people from the judiciary of Brazil, the military of Brazil, the Clinton-Obama State Department, that we need to get this out there. This needs to be something that's certainly not just the great, Bernie's, of course, talked about it because he's better on these things, but anybody who wants a Democratic nomination needs to have something to say about the crisis in terms of Bolsonaro, but also the broader sort of attack on pink tide governments and the political persecution and lawfare of Lula because we helped support it.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think something like what President Bernie should do is in the first 10 days do something like demand Lula's freedom. Right. I think that's a legitimate moral call that the President of the United States is uniquely able to make. And I think that things like that are things that are really important to do, which is to take a moral stance and essentially say that we're not going to allow the illegal persecution of leftists throughout Latin America. And particularly, as you said, we kind of broke the entire continent and have for a long time. And so that there's actually also a moral responsibility to do things like demand Lula's freedom and work for the, and work for progressive goals throughout the continent. So I think that that's something that's absolutely legitimate and something that needs to be done. And I think exactly what you said is exactly right, in the sense that this is really a campaign of popularization and letting people just know what's going on in the world. And this is why I think one of the most important things a left-wing foreign policy could do is actually declassify information. Right? Yeah. Let people know what the State Department knows about Brazilian politics and history, right? Let the Brazilian people know. Let the people of Latin America know what's going on, because we have this enormous data gathering, basically class of organizations that is able to do that. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that the CIA is also one of those data gathering organizations, and that has done enormous damage in the world and will no doubt continue to do enormous damage in the world. And it just highlights the complexities of these questions and that there's really no easy answers, unfortunately. But we have to live with the world as it is. And I think left-wing governments or left-wing presidential administration would need to think about what elements of like the diplomacy that it would want to keep and what elements of the awful national security state it would want to get rid of, which I think is probably most elements, frankly, of the national security state, but then also what sort of minimal data gathering informational bodies that it would want so that people know what goes on in Brazil. And more importantly than Americans knowing this, so that Brazilians are able to know what are behind the machinations of their, for example, fascist leader today.
100%. And I want to say, I think we have a link to it that we could put up on screen for a second, but there's one of the campaigns now that the Free Lula movement in Brazil has been pushing for is to get him nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for eliminating hunger in Brazil. And I would recommend, I mean, I've signed this, and I think, I'm very skeptical of collectivism, but I think signing this petition on change.org to nominate Lula for a Nobel Peace Prize is actually a very effective and very smart way of this civil society campaign, both for, look, a very good leader and someone who's been horrifically prosecuted. And really at the point I just want to underscore, like, I don't trust anything. I mean, any new information that you get coming out about Lula from this Brazilian government now, I mean, let alone even the last several years, which have already been illegitimate with the process, that the coup that removed Dilma. But I mean, now we literally have in Sergio Moro a guy who is saying no comment to corruption stories that are happening right now about the Bolsonaro family, and has said, one of his intentions was to figure out corruption in Brazil's labor unions. This is all politicized, and it's no surprise that Forbes magazine and Bloomberg and others, as well as, I mean, very depressingly, but I guess not surprisingly, the New York Times and the Guardian, their reporting on this has been atrocious, and basically just kind of funneled stuff from U.S. trade associations. So I would sign that. And encourage everybody. I have, and I'd encourage everybody to as well. You just enjoyed that Michael Brooks Show video, and you can get a lot more by subscribing to us here at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It's literally right there.